The universe operates on principles we understand: physics, chemistry, the fundamental laws of cause and effect. But what happens when something defies every sensor, every theory, every rational explanation? Captain Jean-Luc Picard had learned long ago that the cosmos harbors mysteries beyond the Federation's grasp. He'd faced Q's omnipotent games, encountered temporal anomalies that bent the laws of causality, and negotiated with beings that existed simultaneously across multiple dimensions. Yet nothing could have prepared him for what the Enterprise DS sensors detected on a routine survey mission near the Caleb sector. The anomaly appeared without warning: a sudden rupture in subspace, cascading chronoton particles, and an energy signature that data struggled to classify. "Captain," the android reported, his positronic processors working at maximum capacity, "the subspace distortion is collapsing inward. Transporters are detecting 2 humanoid life signs within the affected region." Picard straightened in his command chair, his decades of Starfleet experience crystallizing into calm focus. "Red alert. All hands to stations. Yellow alert, shields up, but hold fire. Hail the anomaly." "No response to any frequency, sir," Worf growled from tactical, his Klingon features tensed with anticipation. "Readings suggest the distortion originated from outside our known dimensional parameters. Unknown technology." The anomaly intensified, reality itself seeming to fracture like ice beneath tremendous pressure. Then, with a sound like reality snapping back into place, the transporter effect erupted across the Enterprise DS main bridge, not in the transporter room, but here, in the heart of the ship. 2 figures materialized in the center of the bridge, their appearance striking every member of the crew into stunned silence. The first was impossibly ancient, no more than 3 feet tall, with green leathery skin and enormous ears that seemed to absorb the very air around him. He wore robes of earth brown, and his eyes, ancient, luminous, infinitely tired, surveyed the bridge with the calm assessment of someone who had seen civilizations rise and fall. His name was Yoda, though none aboard the Enterprise D knew it yet. Beside him stood a human man of middle years, with auburn hair graying at the temples, blue eyes sharp with intelligence and concern, dressed in robes of similar design. Obi-Wan Kenobi's hand instinctively moved toward his left hip, where his lightsaber should have been. It was not there. Neither of them had their weapons. "Status report," Yoda said, his voice soft yet commanding, each word weighted with authority. He spoke without moving his mouth unnaturally, his basic translation implants, a technology that seemed to exist by pure chance, allowing him to communicate. Obi-Wan's eyes, meanwhile, darted from console to console, taking in the technological landscape around them with the tactical precision of a seasoned warrior and diplomat. Picard rose slowly from his command chair, his diplomatic instincts overriding the security protocol screaming through the bridge. This was first contact, regardless of the unconventional circumstances. "I am Captain Jean-Luc Picard of the Federation Starship Enterprise. You've appeared aboard my vessel through an unexplained dimensional rift. I mean you no harm, but I must ask, who are you, and where are you from?" Yoda tilted his head, a gesture that somehow conveyed both recognition and profound sadness. "From far, we have come. Lost between worlds, we are. Obi-Wan Kenobi," he gestured toward his companion, "my former student, he is. Yoda, I am. Of the Jedi Order, we were. Fighting a war, we were, when through the Force, a disturbance came. Torn from our dimension, we believe we have been." Data's eyebrow raised, a gesture he had perfected through years of studying human behavior. "A force, Captain. Unknown energy phenomenon. Attempting classification now." His fingers flew across his console, scanning the 2 beings for any residual energy signatures. What he found defied explanation. Around both figures, there was an energy field unlike anything in the Federation database. It didn't read as electromagnetic, subspace, or any known form of radiation. Yet it was undeniably present, measurable, real. Sensors detect significant energy readings around both individuals, Data reported, his voice maintaining its characteristic precision despite the anomaly. The readings are unlike anything in our database. They appear to fluctuate with the individual's emotional and mental states. Most intriguing, the energy signatures create a coherence pattern similar to subspace harmonics, yet operating on principles that standard Federation physics cannot fully explain. Obi-Wan stepped forward, his movements measured and peaceful, palms open in a universal gesture of non-aggression. "We mean no threat, Captain Picard. We are explorers, as I suspect you are. Our order was dedicated to peace and justice across the galaxy we knew. We are displaced. Uncertain of how we arrived in your ship, or indeed, what galaxy this is." Picard studied them both with the careful attention of a scholar and a captain. Their appearance was unusual but not inherently hostile. Their demeanor suggested training, discipline, and a philosophical bent that reminded him of the Vulcan's approach to logic, though filtered through a distinctly humanistic lens. "You may stand easy, both of you. You are aboard the Federation starship Enterprise D, the flagship of the United Federation of Planets. The year, by your calendar, is 2369. We operate under principles of peaceful exploration and the prime directive, non-interference with developing civilizations." Yoda's ancient eyes seemed to recognize something in those words. A faint smile crossed his weathered face. "Prime directive, you say? Similar to the code of the Jedi, it is. Living in harmony with the Force, respecting all life, we sought to do. Served the Republic, we did, though the cost of that service." He trailed off, a cloud of profound loss crossing his features. Worf, unconvinced by philosophy, maintained his tactical assessment. "Captain, we should detain them until we verify their story. They could be infiltrators, spies, or they could be exactly what they claim," Picard interrupted gently, his eyes still locked on Yoda and Obi-Wan. "Mr. Data, begin a full sensor analysis. Establish quarters for our guests," and Counselor Troy, he turned to face the half-betazoid officer at the secondary console, "join us in the observation lounge. I suspect we'll be having a very long conversation." As security officers moved to escort the Jedi, Picard found himself wondering what forces in the cosmos could pull beings from one dimension to another, and what role fate had played in their arrival. Part of him sensed that the presence of these ancient masters would change everything about the Federation's understanding of itself. The first test would be simple: could beings of mysticism and philosophy find common ground with a civilization built on science and reason? If you want to see more characters enter the Star Trek universe, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character you'd want to see in the comments below. Live long and prosper. The observation lounge of the Enterprise D offered a sweeping vista of the stars, a constant reminder of the vastness that lay beyond the ship's corridors. Picard had chosen this location deliberately, neutral ground, impressive without being intimidating, a place where conversations of significance typically occurred. Yoda and Obi-Wan stood at the viewport, their expressions reflecting something between wonder and homesickness as they gazed out at a universe that was fundamentally alien to them. Counselor Deanna Troi entered with her characteristic grace, her empathic abilities already reaching out to sense the emotional landscape of their guests. She paused, her dark eyes widening slightly. "Captain, their emotional signatures are complex. Layered. There's confusion, certainly, but also a profound sense of acceptance. They seem almost unsurprised by displacement, as if they've prepared for such contingencies." Yoda turned from the viewport, his ears swiveling toward Troy with evident interest. "Sense you can, the emotional currents around us. Empathic, you are." His gaze lingered on her with recognition. "Trained in feeling, you have been. Dangerous gift, this is, if disciplined it is not. Control it, you must, or control you it will." Troy felt the weight of his words, her empathic senses detecting the absolute sincerity beneath them. This small alien had lived through things she could barely imagine, and his counsel came not from arrogance but from genuine wisdom earned through centuries of experience. You speak as though you understand precisely what I experience. The Force connects all living things, Obi-Wan explained, moving to sit at the table with the ease of someone accustomed to formal negotiations. It flows through you, though you may not perceive it in the way we do. What you call empathy, we might call sensitivity to the Force's emotional resonance. The principles are not entirely dissimilar. He gestured to the seats around the table, a subtle invitation that somehow carried the weight of diplomacy between worlds. Picard settled across from Yoda, studying the ancient being with the intensity of a man cataloging everything for the historical record. I'll be direct, as the Federation prefers. You claim to be Jedi, members of an order dedicated to peace and justice. Your technology, as far as we can determine, is not particularly advanced by Federation standards. Yet your abilities, this Force you reference, operate on principles our science cannot easily explain. Help me understand, what are you? Yoda's ancient face crinkled into something between a smile and a sigh. Easy to explain, difficult it is. Energy, the Force is, but more than energy. Connection, it is. Between all living things, flows it does. Biology, consciousness, matter itself, woven together by threads invisible they are. Manipulate these threads, Jedi learn to do. Move objects, see futures, heal wounds, communicate across vast distances, possible these become, with training and discipline. Data, who had been permitted to observe from a console in the corner, leaned forward with his characteristic intensity. Captain, I am detecting what appears to be a sustained energy field around both individuals. It fluctuates in response to their emotional states and their speech patterns. The modulation suggests intentional control. If I may propose a hypothesis. The Force, they describe, may be a form of energy manipulation based on principles analogous to subspace harmonics, but operating through biological neural pathways rather than technological infrastructure. Precisely, your analysis approaches the truth, Obi-Wan said, regarding data with evident appreciation. Though I suspect you'll find that in our universe, the distinction between biological and technological is less absolute than in yours. The Force exists in all living things, yet it can also be channeled through meditation and training into forms that might appear technological to an outside observer. Worf, standing at his customary position near the door, maintained his tactical assessment but found his warrior's instincts responding to something in Obi-Wan's bearing. This was a man who had fought, who understood combat and honor, yet who chose words first. That resonated with Klingon philosophy in unexpected ways. Your order, this Jedi Order, they fight. They wage war. Fought, we did, when fight we must, Yoda replied, his expression becoming grave. Peacekeepers, primarily, we were. Diplomats, counselors, protectors of the weak. But when evil rose, when the darkness threatened all, fight we did. And lost we did. The weight of that defeat, of Order 66 and the fall of the Jedi, hung in the air like a physical presence. Picard noticed the shift in emotional atmosphere immediately. Counselor Troy's empathic senses were probably reacting to the profound grief beneath Yoda's words. You speak of a significant defeat. Recent? From our perspective, days ago it was, Obi-Wan said quietly. Though your sensors suggest we've somehow traveled not just across space but across time itself. Our order was destroyed. Our people were hunted. We were meditating, attempting to contact survivors, when the dimensional rift occurred. Whether it was chance or the will of the Force itself, we cannot yet determine. The implications settled over the observation lounge like a weight. These were refugees, survivors of catastrophe, displaced not just spatially but temporally. Picard understood the burden of that immediately. He'd faced similar situations with other species, other survivors. The Prime Directive suddenly felt more complicated. These beings had violated no Federation law, had arrived through no intentional action of their own, and represented no immediate threat. Yet they were beings of power and knowledge, potentially valuable to multiple factions if word of their existence spread. "Your order was hunted," Picard said carefully. "By whom?" "Betrayed, we were," Yoda said, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. "By those closest to us, the betrayal came. Orchestrated, it was, by forces we did not fully understand until too late. Government, corrupted it had become. Fear and suspicion, used as weapons they were. The Jedi, blamed for the war's continuation, we were, though peace we sought always." Data's positronic mind was already making connections, cross-referencing historical patterns. A pattern of governmental collapse preceded by ideological corruption and scapegoating of minority groups. Similar to Earth's Nazi regime, the Stalinist purges, and the Dominion Wars of the 23rd century. "History repeating, it does," Yoda agreed sadly. "Across galaxies and timelines, the same darkness rises when vigilance fails." Picard glanced at Troi, seeing her emotional reaction to the tragedy these beings had endured. He made a decision, one that would set in motion a series of events that would test the Federation's principles in ways the Prime Directive had never anticipated. "You are welcome aboard the Enterprise D. We will provide you with quarters, access to our resources, and time to understand what has happened to you. Whether you wish to seek a way home or explore what opportunities might exist in this galaxy, that choice remains yours. The Federation believes in the dignity of all sentient beings and the right to self-determination." Obi-Wan's eyes reflected something like hope for the first time since arriving on the bridge. "Your words mirror ideals we held dear, Captain. We are grateful for your compassion. But I suspect our arrival aboard your vessel will not remain unknown for long. There are forces in this galaxy, even as there were in ours, that would seek to control or exploit beings of unusual power. That concern," Worf rumbled, a hint of anticipation in his voice, "has already occurred to me. If they are discovered by the Klingon Empire, the Romulans, or worse," he didn't finish, but the implication was clear. Picard nodded, understanding the strategic complications immediately. A refugee crisis was one thing. A crisis involving beings of mysterious power was another entirely. He would need to inform Starfleet Command, but carefully, and he would need to ensure that these two ancient masters were not simply turned into weapons or research subjects. "Welcome to the Federation," Picard said formally. "I suspect your presence here will change everything we thought we knew about the universe." The Enterprise D's main computer had never encountered a classification problem quite like this. Data spent the first 12 hours of Yoda and Obi-Wan's presence running every conceivable diagnostic, analyzing energy signatures, cross-referencing the vague descriptions of the Force against Federation scientific frameworks. By the time he requested a meeting with Picard in the captain's ready room, his positronic processors had generated 17 different hypothesis models, and none of them fit comfortably within established physics. "Captain, I believe I have made a significant discovery," Data announced, his fingers already manipulating the holographic display that materialized above Picard's desk. The visualization showed a complex web of energy patterns, oscillating between visible light and invisible spectrums. "The energy signatures surrounding our guests are not random. They follow what I can only describe as a harmonic pattern, similar in structure to subspace harmonics used in warp field generation, yet operating on an entirely different dimensional axis." Picard leaned forward, his eyes tracking the intricate dance of the holographic display. "Explain it in simpler terms, Mr. Data." "Very well, sir. Warp drive technology manipulates subspace to create localized regions of spacetime contraction and expansion, allowing faster-than-light travel. The principles involve controlling energy flows through dimensional barriers that exist adjacent to normal spacetime." Data's hands moved with precise grace as he adjusted the visualization. "What I believe the Force represents is a form of biological energy manipulation that accesses similar dimensional layers, but through neural pathways rather than technological infrastructure. It is as though they possess biological warp engines integrated into their consciousness itself. The implications cascaded through Picard's mind like dominoes falling in predetermined sequence. You're suggesting that their abilities operate on the same fundamental principles as warp technology? More than that, sir. I am suggesting that their abilities may represent an alternative pathway to manipulating spacetime. While Federation engineers require sophisticated machinery to achieve these effects, the Jedi appear capable of generating comparable results through meditation and mental discipline. Their mastery extends beyond mere energy manipulation. According to my analysis of their biosignatures during meditation, they are literally interfacing with subspace harmonics at a quantum level. Before Picard could respond, his combadge chirped. Engineering to Captain, Chief Engineer Geordi LaForge's voice crackled through. Sir, we've got some unusual readings from Deck 7. It's where we quartered your guests. You should come see this. Picard and Data made their way to Deck 7, where they found a scene that defied immediate explanation. The quarters assigned to Yoda had been transformed into something resembling a meditation chamber. The lights had been dimmed to near darkness, and the air itself seemed to shimmer with barely visible energy patterns. Obi-Wan sat in perfect meditation posture on the floor, his eyes closed, his breathing synchronized with a rhythm that seemed almost musical. Yoda floated approximately 1 meter above the floor, suspended by nothing visible, his entire small form radiating pale blue light. Geordi stood in the doorway, his visor's sophisticated sensors unable to fully process what they were detecting. Captain, the energy readings are off the scale. Whatever they're doing, it's somehow integrating with the ship's systems. I'm reading fluctuations in the warp core, minor but consistent. They're not draining power. It's more like they're communicating with it somehow. Data's optical sensors widened, the android equivalent of astonishment. Fascinating. They are not generating the energy independently. They are accessing subspace harmonics that already exist within the warp field itself. Captain, I believe they are literally conversing with the underlying structure of spacetime. It is analogous to a musician playing an instrument rather than constructing one. As they watched, Yoda's eyes opened, and his small form gently descended to the floor with the grace of falling leaves. The blue luminescence faded, though traces of it seemed to linger in the air like afterimages. Sense the ship's resonance, we can, he said, his voice still carrying the meditative calm of his trance. Ancient rhythms, familiar they are. Different frequencies, yes, but the underlying song, the same song it is, sung across infinite variations. Obi-Wan opened his eyes and rose fluidly from his meditation posture. When we arrived, we were disoriented. Our connection to the Force was disrupted by the dimensional transition. But now, we are adapting. The Force operates differently here, but it operates nonetheless. It is like learning a new language, the grammar differs, but the fundamental concepts translate. Can you teach us? Data asked, his curiosity overriding standard protocol. If the Force operates through biological neural pathways, and if those pathways can be understood scientifically, could Federation personnel potentially learn to access these abilities? Yoda and Obi-Wan exchanged a meaningful glance. A moment of silent communication that seemed to bypass conventional language entirely. When Yoda spoke again, his ancient voice carried a weight of caution. Teach, we could. But ready, few are. The Force demands discipline, patience, surrender to something greater than oneself. In your Federation, driven by logic and reason you are. Trust in the unseen, difficult it would be. Nevertheless, Obi-Wan added, the attempt would be valuable. We have lost so much of the Jedi Order's knowledge. If we could preserve even fragments of it here, in this universe, perhaps our sacrifice would not be entirely in vain. Picard made a command decision. I'm going to notify Starfleet Command of what we've discovered. They'll want to establish a formal research protocol, but I'm putting you both under my direct command for now. Mr. Data, work with our guests to develop a scientific framework for understanding the Force. If there's any way to document and potentially teach these abilities, we need to understand the mechanism first. Over the next 72 hours, the Enterprise D became a hybrid research facility and monastery. Data and Yoda conducted extensive interviews, with the android recording every detail about meditation techniques, Force sensitivity, the philosophy underlying Jedi training. Obi-Wan worked with Counselor Troi, helping her refine her empathic abilities by teaching her to sense the Force's resonances. The results were remarkable. Troi reported a threefold increase in her empathic range and clarity. But complications were already beginning to surface. Starfleet Command's response to Picard's initial reports was cautiously enthusiastic, but the underlying tension in their communication suggested political pressure. Admiral Sati, the head of Starfleet security, made her interest in the Jedi explicitly clear through subspace channels. Section 31, the shadowy intelligence division that technically didn't exist but everyone knew did, began making discreet inquiries about the nature of the Force and its potential applications as a weapon. The greatest complication, however, came during a routine sensor sweep of the surrounding space. The Enterprise D's long-range sensors detected an approaching vessel, its signature unlike anything in Federation databases. It was massive, geometrically perfect, a cube of incomprehensible size moving with inexorable purpose. When Data ran the identification subroutines, his positronic processors seemed to stagger under the implications. "Captain to the bridge," Picard said calmly into his comm badge, already moving toward the exit. When he arrived at the command center, Worf's face bore an expression of grim certainty. "The Borg, sir. We've identified it as a Borg cube. And they are transmitting." The message was brief, mechanical, delivered in a collective voice that represented billions of assimilated voices speaking in perfect unison. "We have detected the presence of biological distinctiveness previously unknown to us. Your vessel harbors beings of unique technological and physiological merit. Resistance is futile. Prepare to be assimilated. Your biological and technological distinctiveness will add to our perfection." The cube was still 17 light-years distant, but closing on an intercept course at warp 9. Picard felt the weight of decision settling on his shoulders like a physical force. The Borg did not bluff. They did not negotiate. They assimilated or destroyed. And somehow, through means Picard was still struggling to understand, they had detected the presence of Force users aboard his ship. He looked up at the main viewscreen, watching the stars scroll past at high warp velocity. "All hands to yellow alert. Mr. LaForge, prepare the warp core for maximum output. I want us at warp 9.5 if possible. And someone notify our guests that the universe has become considerably more hostile than it was 3 days ago." The cascade of crises had begun. The observation lounge had transformed into a war room. Picard stood at the head of the table, his expression grave as he reviewed tactical projections with his senior staff. The Borg cube's trajectory was relentless, their velocity matching the Enterprise D's maximum sustainable speed. Within 72 hours, they would be in weapons range. Within 96 hours, the Enterprise D would be caught, disabled, and assimilated. The mathematics of the situation were brutally simple. "The Borg have never shown interest in individuals before," Riker observed, his hands clasped tightly on the table. "They assimilate species for their technological and biological distinctiveness as collectives. Why would they pursue two individuals so aggressively?" Data's response came with clinical precision. "The Borg collective operates on a heuristic principle of assimilation value. A single drone offers minimal advantage. However, if the Force represents a previously unknown form of energy manipulation based on biological neural pathways rather than technological infrastructure, the collective would perceive it as a significant gap in their technological knowledge. The ability to manipulate subspace through consciousness rather than machinery would fundamentally alter their assimilation protocols and potentially grant them access to biological capabilities they have never encountered." Worf leaned back in his chair, his tactical mind already running through engagement scenarios. We cannot outrun them indefinitely. Our maximum sustainable velocity is identical to theirs. Eventually, they will corner us. We need to consider weapons that might be effective against Borg technology. Conventional weapons have proven largely ineffective, Picard reminded them quietly. The Borg adapt to directed energy attacks within seconds. Their armor regenerates faster than we can inflict damage. And if we damage their systems, they repair them through assimilation of surrounding matter and compartmentalized redundancy. It's not a fight we can win through firepower alone. The door to the observation lounge opened, and Yoda entered with the measured pace of someone accustomed to momentous occasions. Obi-Wan followed, his presence carrying a calm authority that seemed to ease the tension fractionally. Both had sensed the disturbance in the ship's emotional atmosphere, the fear, the urgency, the collective anxiety of a crew facing an existential threat. The Borg, Yoda said, seating himself with surprising authority despite his diminutive frame. Encountered them, have you? Not directly, Picard replied. But they are a cybernetic collective that assimilates other species. They are unlike anything you've encountered, machines and biology fused into a hive consciousness. They do not negotiate. They do not surrender. They only assimilate or destroy. Obi-Wan's eyes narrowed with strategic assessment. And they seek us specifically. Your Force abilities represent something unprecedented in their database, Data explained. A form of power manipulation that operates through biological consciousness rather than technological means. The Borg perceive this as a gap in their technological perfection. They will stop at nothing to assimilate you and integrate your abilities into their collective consciousness. Yoda's ancient face crinkled into an expression of profound contemplation. Seen this before, I have. In my 900 years, many empires have risen that sought to consume all individuality, all unique perspective, into unified whole. Always, they failed. Not through strength of arms alone, but through understanding that diversity itself is strength. The Force teaches this truth, in infinite variations expressed, infinite possibilities exist. The Borg might not agree, Riker said grimly. They view individuality as a flaw to be eliminated. Then we must show them otherwise, Obi-Wan said quietly. Though I suspect the Borg are incapable of truly learning such a lesson. Before anyone could respond, the ship's alert system triggered. Yellow alert. Unidentified vessel approaching, announced the operations officer. But this alert was different from the Borg sensor contact. This signature was unlike anything in any database, including the one maintained by the combined Federation, Romulan, and Klingon intelligence agencies. The vessel simply appeared, phasing into normal space as though it had always been there and everyone else had simply failed to notice. It was beautiful in a way that defied conventional aesthetics. The ship was not angular or utilitarian like Borg vessels. It was organic, flowing, composed of curves and spirals that seemed to exist in more dimensions than three. Its surface rippled with colors that had no names, hues that seemed to exist outside the normal spectrum. And emblazoned across its hull in a language everyone somehow understood despite never learning it, was a single word, continuum. Worf's hand moved instinctively toward his weapons console, but Picard's raised hand stopped him. Stand down. I think I know who this is. The view screen flickered, and suddenly, the bridge was no longer empty except for the crew. A figure materialized before them. Human in appearance, yet radiating an aura of absolute power that made even Yoda's ancient eyes widen with something approaching awe. The man wore period clothing from Earth's Enlightenment era, and his expression carried the amused arrogance of someone who had transcended conventional morality millennia ago. Well, Q said, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to bypass the auditory system and resonate directly in consciousness. How delightfully unexpected. I leave you alone for a few weeks to attend to matters of omnipotent significance, and what do I find? Not only has Captain Picard managed to acquire two of the most philosophically interesting beings this universe has ever produced, but the Borg have also noticed them. This is becoming far more entertaining than I anticipated. Q, Picard said, his voice steady despite the metaphysical complications that just arrived. I should have known you'd be involved somehow. Involved? Darling, I'm not involved. I'm merely observing. Though I confess, the arrival of Force users in a universe governed by scientific rationalism presents a delicious paradox. Can mysticism exist in a reality built on empirical evidence? Can beings of faith survive in a cosmos where everything must be measurable and quantifiable? Q turned his attention directly to Yoda and Obi-Wan, his eyes gleaming with intellectual hunger. You two interest me far more than most. Most beings grovel before me, fear me, worship me. But you don't seem particularly impressed by my power. Yoda rose slowly, his ears swiveling toward Q with evident curiosity. Powerful, you are. Ancient, you are. But limited, you also are. In all your power, the fundamental truth escaped you, that power itself is illusion. The Force flows through all things, connects all things. Your omnipotence is isolation, not mastery. Alone in your infinity, you are. Q's expression flickered, not quite anger, but something approaching genuine surprise. In billions of years, few beings had challenged his supremacy so directly, so philosophically. Interesting. Very interesting indeed. You propose that despite my literal godhood, I am somehow spiritually deficient. That consciousness divorced from this mystical force of yours represents a form of impoverishment. Propose nothing, I do, Yoda replied. Observe, you merely should. The lesson reveals itself to those who listen. Q laughed, a sound like bells and thunder and the end of universes. You know what? I like you. In fact, I'm going to make this situation significantly more interesting. I'm going to give you a choice, Captain Picard, one that will define the Federation's future and possibly the fate of these two ancient masters. I'm listening, Picard said carefully, knowing that when Q offered choices, the stakes were invariably higher than anyone initially realized. The Borg approach. They seek to assimilate these Jedi, to add their biological and technological distinctiveness to their collective perfection. They will succeed, too, your ship cannot stop them. So here is your choice, allow them to be assimilated, and I will prevent the Borg from assimilating anyone else from your Federation for the next 100 years. Or, attempt to save them and watch as the Borg adapt, improve, and become an existential threat to every species in the quadrant. The distinctiveness of the Force, integrated into Borg technology, would make them virtually unstoppable. Picard felt the weight of impossible choice settle across his shoulders. And if we choose a third option? Then you're even more delightful than I suspected, Q said with genuine delight. Perhaps, Picard, you humans might yet surprise me after all these centuries. Very well. I will give you a hint, sometimes the greatest power lies not in resisting change, but in understanding it, adapting to it, and transforming it into something neither the oppressor nor the oppressed anticipated. With that, Q vanished, his impossible ship phasing out of normal space as mysteriously as it had arrived, leaving the Enterprise DS crew staring at empty viewscreen and the stark reality of impossible choices. The Borg cube continued its relentless approach. The bridge fell silent in the wake of Q's departure, the kind of silence that preceded major decisions. Picard's mind was already calculating probabilities, weighing options, and searching for the third path that Q had hinted at. With the Borg cube closing at their maximum sustainable velocity, time was becoming a resource more precious than warp core fuel. Captain, I have analyzed Q's statement, Data said, his fingers dancing across his console with characteristic precision. The Borg's greatest weakness has always been their predictability. They follow optimization algorithms designed to maximize assimilation efficiency. If we could present them with a scenario that appears to offer greater assimilation value through an alternative path, their heuristic protocols might redirect them toward that opportunity instead of pursuing direct confrontation. Worf leaned forward with tactical interest. What kind of alternative path? That, Obi-Wan said quietly, is where the Force becomes relevant. The Borg perceive power as technological advantage. But what if we could demonstrate that the Force represents a form of power that cannot be assimilated through conventional means? Yoda's ancient eyes gleamed with understanding. Propose you do, a demonstration. Show them, we could, that assimilation of the Force requires something the collective cannot provide: individual consciousness, personal agency, spiritual discipline. These things, incompatible with hive mind they are. Picard began to see the outline of the strategy. You're suggesting we transmit a subspace message to the Borg cube, revealing that the Force cannot be assimilated without fundamentally altering the nature of the collective itself. That our presence here threatens their operational integrity rather than enhancing it. More than suggest, I do, Yoda said. Demonstrate it, we must. In their presence, meditate we shall. Show them. The Force in action, without resistance we offer. Let them analyze, let them attempt to understand through their cybernetic filters. Their own scientists will determine what we tell them, incompatible with assimilation, we are. Geordi LaForge, monitoring systems from the engineering console, interjected with practical concern. Sir, demonstrating Force abilities near Borg sensor equipment could give them detailed analysis of your physiology and neural patterns. They might be able to work around the limitations we're claiming exist. A calculated risk, Picard acknowledged. But less risky than allowing them to assimilate you both through conventional boarding procedures. Mr. Data, compose a subspace message. Inform the Borg that we are transmitting detailed bioscan data of our passengers. Tell them we are placing the individuals in question in their presence to allow direct analysis. Frame it as cooperation rather than resistance. The message went out across subspace with the cold precision of Federation diplomatic protocols. For 18 hours, nothing changed. The Borg cube maintained its pursuit vector, neither accelerating nor decelerating. Then, suddenly, their velocity dropped. The cube veered toward a spatial coordinates that placed it within visual range of the Enterprise D, though still maintaining a distance of approximately 50,000 kilometers. A probe detached from the Borg cube and approached the Enterprise D under its own propulsion. It docked with the starship's auxiliary port, and automated systems began transmitting a single demand: transmit the Force users to the probe. Voluntary compliance will result in minimal casualties. They're calling our bluff, Riker muttered. They want direct access. Then we give it to them, Obi-Wan said. But not in the way they expect. We go to the probe ourselves, willingly. We meditate in their presence. We allow their sensors to analyze every aspect of what the Force is and how it functions. But we do not resist. Resistance triggers their assimilation protocols. Instead, we demonstrate. Yoda and Obi-Wan made their way to the auxiliary transporter room, where they dematerialized and rematerialized inside the probe's cramped interior. The probe was less a vessel and more a sensory platform, all instruments and analysis equipment, minimal life support. A single Borg drone stood motionless in the center, its cybernetic eye rotating to focus on the arrivals. Biological and technological distinctiveness acknowledged, the drone announced in the collective voice. Prepare for assimilation. Yoda settled into a meditation position on the probe's metallic floor, his ancient body assuming a posture that seemed to center the entire space around itself. Obi-Wan joined him, their breathing synchronizing into a rhythm that seemed to reverberate through the very structure of the probe. Aboard the Enterprise D, Data monitored the subspace data transmission from the probe with intense focus. What he observed defied conventional explanation. As Yoda and Obi-Wan entered their meditative state, the Force signatures around them intensified, creating harmonic resonances that appeared to actually interfere with the Borg's analytical sensors. The more deeply they meditated, the more incomprehensible their biosignatures became to the cybernetic analysis equipment. The Borg drone's optical implant began to flicker. Its movement became erratic, its posture destabilizing. The drone's voice took on a tone of distress that the collective rarely permitted its drones to express: incompatible. Analytical framework insufficient. Biological organization transcends cybernetic classification. Consciousness exhibits properties that cannot be quantified through conventional sensory apparatus. Assimilation protocols failing. Assimilation protocols failing. In the probe, Yoda opened one eye and looked directly at the malfunctioning drone. "Your perfection," he said softly, "is incomplete. Add to your distinctiveness, we cannot, because distinctiveness itself, incompatible with your purpose it is. Individuality, you have eliminated. Consciousness, you have subsumed. The Force flows through consciousness, through individual will and awareness. In collective mind, the Force becomes noise, becomes interference, becomes enemy." The drone systems overloaded. Its cybernetic components began to emit sparks and acrid smoke. The collective consciousness commanding it was attempting to compensate for the analytical failure, trying to force understanding through brute computational power. But the Force, as it manifested through Yoda and Obi-Wan's consciousness, was fundamentally antithetical to the Borg's nature. It could no more be assimilated than individuality could be merged with hive mind without destroying the hive itself. The probe's bulkhead doors sealed automatically, isolating the malfunctioning drone. A brief, violent decompression ejected it into the vacuum of space. The probe itself began to broadcast a distress signal back to the Borg cube. Inside the cube, thousands of kilometers away, the collective experienced something it rarely experienced: uncertainty. The biological distinctiveness it had pursued was proving catastrophically incompatible with its fundamental nature. The assimilation would not strengthen it would poison it from within. Every drone attempting to interface with Force-based consciousness would experience the same system failure, the same irreconcilable paradox between individual awareness and collective purpose. The Borg cube's velocity shifted. It began to move away from the Enterprise D, not in retreat but in methodical redirection. The collective had made its assessment: these beings were not assets to be assimilated. They were threats to be contained, studied from a distance, avoided until a solution could be engineered. The probe released its moorings from the Enterprise D and drifted back toward the cube. Yoda and Obi-Wan materialized on the Enterprise D's transporter pad moments later, their expressions serene despite the intensity of what they had just endured. Picard met them in the transporter room, his expression a mixture of relief and awe. "You risked assimilation to demonstrate that the Force is incompatible with their collective mind." "Risked nothing," Yoda corrected gently. "Understood, we did, that their greatest strength, unity of purpose, is also their greatest vulnerability. Consciousness cannot surrender itself to collective without losing the very thing that allows the Force to flow. The Borg, by their nature, cannot accommodate the Force. And so, accommodate them, we cannot." But even as the Borg cube began to withdraw, a more troubling reality was crystallizing. The collective had documented every detail of the encounter. Its analysis, though unable to utilize the Force itself, had catalogued the parameters of its operation. And somewhere in the vast computational networks of the Borg, a question was forming: could they engineer biological components capable of supporting both individual consciousness and collective coordination? The Borg had not abandoned their pursuit. They had simply changed their strategy, and that change was far more dangerous than direct assimilation would have been. The Enterprise D's corridors had become the site of unexpected collaboration. In the days following the Borg probe incident, Yoda and Obi-Wan began working intensively with Picard and his senior staff to analyze what had transpired. The Borg cube maintained its distance, still within long-range sensor range but no longer approaching. According to Data's calculations, the collective was engaged in some form of massive computational analysis. likely attempting to engineer a solution to the force compatibility problem. They won't stop, Counselor Troy said during a briefing in the Ready Room. The Borg have demonstrated countless times that they simply redirect their efforts when direct assimilation fails. What concerns me more is that they've now documented the Force exists and operates on principles their current technology cannot accommodate. That gap in their perfection will consume their resources until they solve it. Obi-Wan paced near the viewport, his eyes tracking the distant cube visible as a speck against the starfield. In our galaxy, there were beings who pursued absolute power without understanding the philosophical price such pursuit demands. The Borg are not so different. They seek perfection through technological domination and the elimination of individuality. They cannot comprehend that true perfection encompasses contradiction, diversity, and the freedom to choose one's own path. Philosophical observation aside, Worf interjected with characteristic pragmatism, we need a practical solution. How long until the Borg develop a workaround? Data's optical sensors brightened as he accessed the computational models he had been constructing. Based on Borg development cycles and their documented adaptability patterns, I estimate they require between 6 to 12 months to engineer a biological template capable of supporting both individual force sensitivity and collective consciousness integration. However, there is a complicating variable. Which is? Picard asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. The Borg will not limit their research to theoretical models, Data explained. They will require live test subjects. Beings with force sensitivity who can be assimilated and monitored during the integration process. The Borg will seek to acquire such subjects through any means available, negotiation, conquest, or infiltration of Federation space. Yoda's ancient face grew thoughtful, his ears drooping slightly with concern. Understand this, do they? That taking others with force sensitivity, they risk creating what they most fear, individuals within their collective who cannot be controlled, who retain agency despite assimilation. They may not care, Obi-Wan said quietly. The Borg have always accepted acceptable losses in pursuit of assimilation objectives. If they must assimilate thousands to understand how to integrate one force user successfully, they will do so without hesitation. Picard made a decision that would fundamentally alter the Federation's relationship with these two ancient beings. Starfleet Command has requested that you both remain aboard the Enterprise D indefinitely. They want to establish a formal research program, with you as the primary subjects. I've resisted that directive because it seems to contradict the principles of Federation ideals. But I'm beginning to wonder if there's merit to deeper collaboration, not as research subjects, but as partners in understanding and possibly teaching others. Teaching. Obi-Wan's attention snapped toward Picard with renewed focus. You believe the Federation would permit the training of force-sensitive individuals? I believe Captain Picard is proposing something that the Federation's leadership would struggle with significantly, Riker said with a wry smile. An entire discipline of training based on principles that transcend conventional science. Starfleet is built on rationality, evidence-based methodology, and reproducible results. The Force is inherently subjective, requiring faith in something beyond measurement. And yet, Data observed, we have measured the Force. We have documented its energy signatures, analyzed its neural correlates, and created preliminary models of its operational parameters. Perhaps the dichotomy between science and spirituality is less absolute than the Federation has traditionally assumed. Perhaps there exists a framework where both can coexist. Yoda's ancient eyes seemed to look through the walls of the Ready Room, through the ship itself, perceiving something in the fabric of reality that others could not see. Teach, we will. But teach with caution, we must. The Force is not a weapon. Not a tool to be mastered for conquest. Many have learned this lesson too late, at great cost. The balance between seeking the Force and surrendering to it, this balance, difficult to maintain it is. Over the following weeks, an informal academy began to form aboard the Enterprise D, Yoda worked with Counselor Troi, refining her empathic abilities and teaching her to recognize force resonances in the fabric of consciousness around her. Obi-Wan conducted meditation sessions with volunteers from the crew, focusing on disciplines of focus, discipline, and clarity of thought. Data continued his scientific analysis, developing what he termed a phenomenological model of force interaction, essentially creating a bridge between mystical practice and scientific measurement. But complications emerged from unexpected quarters. A subspace message arrived from Starfleet Command, encrypted with the highest security protocols. Admiral Sati had apparently reviewed the reports and determined that force abilities represented a potential strategic advantage. Section 31, the Intelligence Directorate that officially did not exist, had taken particular interest in the potential military applications. The message hinted, not subtly, that Yoda and Obi-Wan should be transferred to a secure facility for more intensive study. Picard understood the implications immediately. They want to weaponize the Force. Predictable, this is, Yoda said when informed of the directive. Power, once discovered, those who seek control always wish to weaponize. The Jedi Order faced the same pressure we did. Resisted, we did, for 1,000 years. But resistance, ultimately futile it became. Here, in your Federation, the same pattern manifests. Science without ethics leads to dominion. Technology without wisdom leads to suffering. What do you propose? Picard asked, though he suspected he would not like the answer. Disappear, we must, Obi-Wan said flatly. Leave the Enterprise D, leave Federation space, and establish ourselves somewhere beyond the reach of both Starfleet and the Borg. We came to this universe without intention. We should not allow ourselves to become the catalyst for conflict within it. The proposal struck at something fundamental in Picard's understanding of Federation principles. You're suggesting we help you evade a direct order from Starfleet Command. Suggesting nothing, Yoda corrected. Acknowledging reality, I am. Your Federation is built on ideals of peace and exploration. But like all governments, it contains those who would sacrifice ideals for security, who would compromise principles for power. If we remain, become weapons we will. If we leave, preserve your ideals, you might. Counselor Troi's empathic senses registered the profound conflict in Picard's emotional state. Captain, your loyalty to Starfleet is being tested against your loyalty to Federation principles. Those two things are not the same thing. Before Picard could respond, the alert system activated. Captain to the bridge, Worf's urgent voice crackled through. We are receiving a distress signal from the Federation colony at Starbase 515. They are under attack by unknown assailants. The description matches Borg technology, but the assault pattern is inconsistent with collective behavior. It appears to be a smaller force, operating with tactical flexibility unusual for Borg drones. Picard felt the situation crystallizing into a terrible clarity. They're here already. The Borg have begun their acquisition operations, and they're using modified drones with enhanced autonomy. More likely, Obi-Wan said with grim certainty, they have begun their solution. The drones attacking that colony are no longer purely collective consciousness. They are attempting to integrate individual will with Borg assimilation. They are creating a hybrid consciousness that can operate independently while remaining connected to the collective. The implications hit everyone simultaneously. The Borg had not abandoned their pursuit. They had simply accelerated their timeline. Somewhere out there, beyond the boundaries of Federation space, they were already conducting live experiments on Force-sensitive beings, trying to crack the code that would allow them to merge individual consciousness with collective purpose. And if they succeeded, the resulting drones would be something the galaxy had never encountered before. Borg soldiers with genuine strategic flexibility, emotional intuition, and the tactical brilliance of individual consciousness married to the computational power and technological enhancement of the collective. The Borg were no longer seeking to assimilate the Force. They were seeking to weaponize it. The Enterprise D raced toward Starbase 515 at maximum sustainable warp velocity, but space itself seemed to conspire against speed. At warp 9.5, the journey would still require 8 hours. By Picard's calculations, the colony would have fallen long before the ship's arrival. What they would find instead were ruins, casualty reports, and evidence of a threat unlike anything the Federation had previously documented. In the captain's ready room, Picard convened an emergency strategy session with his senior staff and their 2 Jedi guests. The tactical situation displayed on his monitor was grimly revealing. The Borg attack on Starbase 515 had been surgical, precise, and, most troublingly, adaptive in ways that suggested tactical flexibility rather than algorithmic efficiency. Analyze these combat patterns, Data said, his fingers moving across the holographic display with mechanical precision. He isolated a sequence of attack vectors, showing how the Borg assault force had shifted tactics in real-time response to the station's defensive measures. Traditional Borg behavior follows predictable optimization algorithms. They employ force application sufficient to achieve objectives, adapting only when specific weapons prove ineffective. This assault pattern demonstrates something fundamentally different. These drones are anticipating Federation response, predicting human behavior, employing feints and misdirection. Tactical flexibility born from individual consciousness, Obi-Wan observed, his warrior's mind immediately grasping the strategic implications. They have succeeded in creating what they sought, drones that retain enough individual agency to think strategically while remaining bound to the collective's purpose. Worf's expression darkened with the weight of tactical nightmare scenarios. If the Borg have truly integrated individual consciousness into their collective framework, they have solved the fundamental problem that has allowed the Federation to resist them. We have always relied on their predictability, on the fact that their assimilation makes them strategically rigid. If that advantage is gone, then we face an enemy that combines the computational power of the collective with the strategic brilliance of individual consciousness, Riker finished grimly. Essentially, we're looking at the most lethal combination of capabilities imaginable. Yoda's ancient eyes seemed to look inward, accessing memories of conflicts in galaxies far away. Seen this pattern before, I have. Empires that sought to merge individual strength with collective purpose. Always, the result was temporary. The consciousness that accepts both individual will and collective command eventually fractures. The psyche cannot sustain such contradiction without psychological deterioration. How long before that deterioration becomes apparent? Picard asked, seizing on even the slimmest hope of tactical advantage. Unknown, it is, Yoda admitted. In the Jedi Order, we trained for balance. Discipline of individual will with service to greater purpose. Took years, it did, and even then, some fell to darkness because balance they could not maintain. The Borg, without such training, without philosophical framework to sustain the paradox, risk catastrophic psychological cascade. But time, they have. Months, perhaps years before critical failure occurs. Data's positronic processors were already calculating probabilities. If we assume the Borg drones require psychological support systems to maintain the integration of individual consciousness and collective purpose, they would need regular reconnection with the collective for reassurance and reinforcement. This suggests they cannot operate independently for extended periods without experiencing mental deterioration. Which means, Picard said, feeling a strategic framework beginning to form, they must remain within communication range of the collective. They cannot be deployed too far from the hive mind that anchors them. That's a vulnerability we might exploit. The Enterprise D arrived at Starbase 515 6 hours later. The devastation was catastrophic but methodical. The Borg had not destroyed the station out of vindictiveness, they had dismantled it with surgical precision, removing technological components, analyzing infrastructure, and, most disturbing, taking captives. According to the few surviving witnesses, the Borg assault force had specifically targeted individuals who exhibited unusual empathic sensitivity or intuitive decision-making capabilities. They were hunting for people with latent force sensitivity, people whose consciousness might be compatible with the hybrid integration they had achieved. Among the missing were 3 Starfleet officers and 7 civilian researchers, including Dr. Sarah Chen, a xenopsychologist who had been conducting preliminary studies on consciousness and quantum entanglement. "They're building their army," Riker said quietly, surveying the damage through the view screen. "Every person they assimilate with force potential strengthens their ability to create more hybrid drones. It's exponential growth." Obi-Wan moved to the tactical display, his military mind analyzing the attack patterns with the precision of someone who had fought in galactic wars. The assault force used a feint approach here. He indicated a section of the defensive perimeter, which allowed their primary force to penetrate the colony's research sector. They knew what they were looking for. Someone told them. Someone within Starfleet or Federation space has provided the Borg with intelligence about force-sensitive individuals. The implication settled across the bridge like a physical weight. Section 31, Picard said quietly. "They've been studying force sensitivity among Federation personnel. They must have compiled lists, profiles, assessments. If that data was compromised, then the Borg possess a roadmap for locating every force-sensitive individual in the Federation." Data completed. The assimilation process would accelerate exponentially. The Borg could create an entirely new tactical doctrine centered on hybrid consciousness drones within weeks rather than months. A subspace message arrived, priority urgent, bearing the encrypted signature of Admiral Sati. The message was direct and left no room for negotiation. Yoda and Obi-Wan were to be transferred immediately to a Federation research facility. Section 31 was taking direct control of the Force user situation. Picard was ordered to cooperate fully or face charges of insubordination. Picard stared at the message, feeling the fundamental contradiction between his loyalty to Starfleet and his understanding of what that order would accomplish. Handing Yoda and Obi-Wan over to Section 31 meant their knowledge, their abilities, their very consciousness would become tools of Federation intelligence. It meant repeating the exact pattern that had led to the Borg's hybrid drone breakthrough in the first place, using force sensitivity as a weapon rather than understanding it as a philosophical discipline. "Captain," Obi-Wan said quietly, understanding what Picard was struggling with, "you face a choice that we have faced many times. Obedience to authority, or fidelity to principle. The Jedi Order was destroyed because we chose obedience, allowing the government we serve to become corrupted without sufficient resistance. I will not ask you to repeat that mistake." "What are you suggesting?" Picard asked, though he knew precisely what was being suggested. "Allow us to leave," Yoda said simply. "Disappear into Federation space, we shall. The Enterprise DS sensors will malfunction briefly, preventing accurate tracking. We will travel to the Gamma Hydri region, where the Federation's influence is minimal and Starfleet resources are stretched thin. There, establish a compromised. Then the Borg possess a roadmap for locating every force-sensitive individual in the Federation." Data completed. The assimilation process would accelerate exponentially. The Borg could create an entirely new tactical doctrine centered on hybrid consciousness drones within weeks rather than months. A subspace message arrived, priority urgent, bearing the encrypted signature of Admiral Sati. The message was direct and left no room for negotiation. Yoda and Obi-Wan were to be transferred immediately to a Federation research facility. Section 31 was taking direct control of the Force user situation. Picard was ordered to cooperate fully or face charges of insubordination. Picard stared at the message, feeling the fundamental contradiction between his loyalty to Starfleet and his understanding of what that order would accomplish. Handing Yoda and Obi-Wan over to Section 31 meant their knowledge, their abilities, their very consciousness would become tools of Federation intelligence. It meant repeating the exact pattern that had led to the Borg's hybrid drone breakthrough in the first place, using force sensitivity as a weapon rather than understanding it as a philosophical discipline. "Captain," Obi-Wan said quietly, understanding what Picard was struggling with, "you face a choice that we have faced many times. Obedience to authority, or fidelity to principle. The Jedi Order was destroyed because we chose obedience, allowing the government we serve to become corrupted without sufficient resistance. I will not ask you to repeat that mistake. What are you suggesting? Picard asked, though he knew precisely what was being suggested. Allow us to leave, Yoda said simply. Disappear into Federation space, we shall. The Enterprise DS sensors will malfunction briefly, preventing accurate tracking. We will travel to the Gamma Hydri region, where the Federation's influence is minimal and Starfleet resources are stretched thin. There, establish a sanctuary we will, where Force-sensitive individuals can seek training and protection. You're asking me to help you evade a direct order from Starfleet Command, Picard said quietly. To defy Section 31. To potentially compromise the Federation's security apparatus. We ask nothing, Yoda corrected gently. Propose, we only do. Your choice, it remains. But understand this, you must, the Federation you serve is being corrupted from within by those who believe the ends justify the means. Stop that corruption, only you can. Not through obedience to corrupted authority, but through resistance to it. Picard looked around his bridge, at Riker's conflicted expression, at Data's analytical detachment processing the ethical implications, at Worf's warrior's understanding of when authority became tyranny. He understood that what happened in the next few minutes would define his Starfleet career, his understanding of Federation principles, and potentially the future of an entire galaxy grappling with the emergence of Force sensitivity in a purely scientific reality. Mr. LaForge, Picard said quietly, I need a sensor malfunction. Make it convincing. Make it look like a transporter cascade failure near the hangar bay. Something catastrophic enough to explain why our guests are no longer aboard. Aye, Captain, Geordi said without hesitation, understanding the implications and accepting them. Within the hour, Yoda and Obi-Wan had made their way to a shuttlecraft in the auxiliary hangar. Data transmitted false sensor data showing their dematerialization in a transporter accident. The Enterprise DS logs would reflect that they had been lost in a cascade failure, their molecular patterns scattered across subspace, irrecoverable. The shuttle detached from the Enterprise D and engaged its cloaking device, a technology Obi-Wan had quickly learned to operate through Force intuition, understanding the principles even though his hands had never touched such systems before. Within minutes, they were gone, leaving behind only questions and a captain who had just fundamentally redefined his relationship with the institution he had served his entire life. Picard composed a message to Admiral Satie, explaining that the guests had been lost in a transporter accident. The investigation would be thorough, he knew, but the physical evidence would support the story. The Federation would mourn their loss, and Section 31 would calculate whether Force-sensitive individuals were worth the resources required to pursue them further. But out in the depths of space, two ancient beings were beginning a new mission. Not to fight the Borg or dominate the Federation, but to preserve the teachings of the Jedi Order in a universe that had no framework for understanding them, and to guide the Force-sensitive individuals within Federation space toward enlightenment rather than weaponization. The galaxy, unknowingly, had entered a new era. 3 weeks passed in careful silence aboard the Enterprise D. Picard maintained his command with the same precision and authority he had always demonstrated, but something fundamental had shifted in his relationship with Starfleet. Section 31's investigation into the transporter accident was thorough but ultimately inconclusive. The molecular dispersion pattern consistent with cascade failure had been perfectly replicated by Geordi's engineering expertise. The inquiry closed with a classification level that ensured few would ever examine it closely. But the political consequences rippled outward in ways Picard had anticipated and accepted. He received a subspace transmission from a Section 31 operative named Director Krell, a woman whose existence was officially denied by every Federation authority, yet whose power was absolute within intelligence circles. The message was encrypted using protocols that Data confirmed were military-grade and virtually impossible to crack. Captain Picard, Krell's recorded message began, her voice carrying the cold precision of someone accustomed to wielding power without accountability. We are aware that your guests did not die in a transporter accident. We are also aware that you deliberately facilitated their departure. This represents a direct violation of Federation security protocols and a betrayal of Starfleet authority. However, we are prepared to allow this transgression to remain unreported on one condition: you will assist Section 31 in locating and acquiring other Force-sensitive individuals currently within Federation space. Your cooperation ensures your career survives. Your continued obstruction ensures your destruction. Picard had deleted the message immediately, but the threat remained real and operational. Section 31 did not make idle pronouncements. They possessed the capability to destroy his career, to place false evidence in his records, to make his life a nightmare of bureaucratic complications. Yet they had also, paradoxically, offered him protection if he complied. Counselor Troy found him in the observation lounge late one evening, staring at the stars with the expression of a man wrestling with fundamental questions about honor and pragmatism. "You're considering their offer," she observed, her empathic senses reading the conflict in his emotional landscape. "I'm considering the reality of my position," Picard corrected gently. Section 31 controls too much of the Federation's intelligence apparatus for me to simply ignore them. If I refuse their cooperation, they will move against me. But if I accept their cooperation, I become complicit in the weaponization of Force sensitivity. Either way, I compromise my principles. "Not necessarily," Troy said, settling into the chair beside him. "There's a third option. You could provide them with information that appears to cooperate with their objectives while actually serving the opposite purpose. Feed them intelligence about Force-sensitive individuals in ways that either protects those individuals or guides them toward Yoda and Obi-Wan's sanctuary rather than into Section 31's hands." Picard turned to face her, a slight smile crossing his features. "Counselor, I believe you're suggesting I become a double agent." "I'm suggesting you use Section 31's own tools against them," Troy replied. "They're accustomed to operating in moral gray areas. Beat them at their own game." The strategy, once articulated, seemed almost elegant in its simplicity. Over the following weeks, Picard began transmitting carefully curated intelligence to Section 31. He identified Force-sensitive individuals, accurate identifications, but with location data that would require elaborate investigation and considerable time to verify. He provided behavioral profiles that painted Force sensitivity as a rare, unpredictable trait requiring extensive study rather than immediate acquisition. Most importantly, he worked with data to subtly alter the quantum signatures that Section 31 used to identify Force-sensitive neural patterns, making genuine Force users appear neurologically mundane while marking Federation operatives as potential Force-sensitive candidates. The result was controlled chaos within Section 31's operational structure. Resources were diverted toward investigating Federation officers who were entirely neurologically normal. Genuine Force-sensitive individuals went undetected while appearing, through the corrupted data, to be located in regions of space where Starfleet maintained heavy presence and Section 31 could not operate without exposure. But while Picard engaged in this shadow intelligence war, a more immediate crisis was developing in Federation space. The Borg hybrid drone operations were accelerating dramatically. Attack patterns suggested the collective had successfully integrated at least 17 Force-sensitive individuals into their hybrid consciousness framework. These drones demonstrated tactical flexibility that pushed Federation defensive capabilities to their limits. "Captain, we are receiving reports of a Borg attack on the Federation colony at Kepler Station," Worf announced during a routine duty shift. "The assault force is significantly larger than previous operations. 14 hybrid drones leading a conventional Borg contingent of approximately 200 standard drones. Colony defenses are being overwhelmed." Picard was already moving toward the tactical display. "Set course for Kepler Station, maximum warp. Mr. Data, begin analyzing the attack patterns. I want to know everything about these hybrid drones' tactical methodology." As the Enterprise D raced toward the beleaguered colony, Data's analysis revealed something deeply troubling. The hybrid drones were not simply more flexible than standard Borg units. They were communicating with each other using protocols that incorporated emotional subtext alongside pure tactical data. They were coordinating through something that approximated intuition, making decisions based on probable outcomes rather than calculated optimization. They were, in essence, thinking like Force users while remaining integrated with the collective consciousness. They've achieved the synthesis. Obi-Wan's voice came through the subspace communication system, transmitted from the cloaked shuttle that had been maintaining a careful distance from Federation space. The Borg have created a framework where individual consciousness and collective purpose can coexist. The psychological deterioration we predicted may be delayed indefinitely if the hybrid drones continue to receive regular reinforcement from the collective. How do we stop them? Riker asked, his tactical mind already searching for vulnerabilities. By understanding that their strength is also their weakness, came Yoda's ancient voice through the same communication channel. Individual consciousness merged with collective purpose creates contradiction. Feed that contradiction, aggravate it, we can. Turn the individual will against the collective command, we might. What are you proposing? Picard asked, understanding that the Jedi were about to suggest something that violated conventional tactical doctrine. Enter the collective's consciousness through subspace communication, Obi-Wan explained. The hybrid drones retain some capacity for force sensitivity. If we could project force energy through subspace, into their consciousness, we could potentially disrupt the psychological framework that keeps them integrated. The individual will within them would experience reassertion, questioning, conflict with collective purpose. That would be an act of war against the Borg collective itself, Data observed. A direct assault on their consciousness rather than their physical infrastructure. The Federation has no precedent for such action. And the Borg have no defense against it, Yoda countered. Technology, they understand. Consciousness itself, they cannot assimilate because they are already consciousness, merged with technology. Attack them at the junction point, we can. Where individual meets collective, where will meets purpose, we can strike. The Enterprise D arrived at Kepler Station to find the colony's defensive grid nearly completely overwhelmed. The hybrid drones were systematically dismantling the station's infrastructure, their tactical flexibility allowing them to exploit every weakness in the Federation's standard defensive protocols. Conventional weapons were ineffective, the hybrid drones adapted to each attack vector faster than even cutting-edge Federation technology could respond. Picard made the decision that would define this phase of the conflict. Mr. Data, establish a subspace communication channel using the quantum encryption protocols Yoda and Obi-Wan provided. Open a direct line to the hybrid drone's consciousness while they are in active combat. I want them to experience conflict between their individual will and their collective purpose. Attempting to establish the link now, Captain, Data reported, his fingers moving across the console with characteristic precision. Through the subspace channel, Yoda and Obi-Wan projected force energy, not as a weapon, but as a beacon of consciousness. They reached into the psychic landscape where the hybrid drones existed, touching the individual awareness that remained imprisoned within the collective consciousness. They showed the drones something the Borg had never intended them to experience, the possibility of choice, the option of autonomy, the reality of what they had lost when they accepted assimilation. The effect was immediate and catastrophic for the Borg operation. 3 of the hybrid drones ceased their assault entirely, their neural integrations beginning to show signs of critical conflict. They stood motionless in the combat zone, their individual consciousness warring with the collective's directives. The psychological framework that Yoda and Obi-Wan had predicted was beginning to fracture under the pressure of enforced contradiction. But the Borg response was equally swift. The collective, recognizing the threat, activated what appeared to be a fail-safe protocol. The 3 hybrid drones experiencing psychological breakdowns suddenly detonated, not explosively, but neurologically. Their consciousness dissolved as the collective ruthlessly severed their connection rather than allow them to become vectors of consciousness-based infiltration. 3 individuals died in that moment, their minds torn apart by the very system that had created them. The Enterprise D's crew witnessed the deaths through their sensors and understood something fundamental about the Borg: they would rather destroy their own creations than allow consciousness to escape their control. The Borg cube withdrew from Kepler Station, its hybrid drone operation suspended. But the message was clear: the collective had discovered a vulnerability, and they were already developing protocols to eliminate it. Force-based consciousness attacks represented a genuine threat, which meant the Borg would evolve countermeasures. The galaxy had entered a new phase of conflict, where consciousness itself had become a battlefield. The convergence began not with a single dramatic moment, but with a cascade of events that suggested something fundamental was shifting in the fabric of Federation politics and galactic strategy. Within days of the Kepler Station attack, Picard received 3 separate subspace communications that fundamentally altered the strategic landscape. The first came from Admiral Satie, transmitted through official Starfleet channels. Section 31 had determined that force sensitivity represented an existential threat to Federation security. They were escalating their acquisition protocols and authorizing the use of any means necessary to locate and contain force-sensitive individuals. The message made clear that Starfleet vessels, including the Enterprise D, would be commandeered if necessary to support these operations. Picard's command would be transferred to a Section 31 operative if he continued to demonstrate insufficient commitment to the initiative. The second message came through an encrypted channel bearing the signature of the Klingon High Council. It seemed the Klingon had monitored the Borg hybrid drone operations with considerable interest. They proposed an alliance with the Federation to combat the threat, but with a price. The Federation must provide the Klingon with access to force-sensitive training. The Klingon Empire saw the Force not as a tool of science but as the ultimate expression of warrior spirituality. They wanted Jedi training integrated into their military doctrine. The third message carried no official attribution, but its origins were unmistakable. It came from the Romulan Star Empire, transmitted through the neutral zone using protocols typically reserved for espionage communications. The Romulans were offering a temporary cessation of hostilities, a truce of indefinite duration, if the Federation would agree to share force training methodologies. The Tal Shiar, the Romulan Intelligence Directorate, had apparently concluded that controlling force sensitivity was more valuable than maintaining traditional military superiority. Picard convened an emergency meeting with his senior staff and requested a secure subspace link with Yoda and Obi-Wan, whose cloaked shuttle was now maintaining position in a spatial region known only to Data and Geordi. When the Jedi appeared on the view screen, their presence somehow commanding despite being transmitted through quantum-encrypted channels across thousands of kilometers. The weight of galactic complications became undeniably apparent. "The Force has become currency," Obi-Wan said quietly, his eyes reflecting something between sadness and resignation. "Every major power in this quadrant recognizes its strategic value. Within weeks, every faction will be moving to acquire it, to weaponize it, to integrate it into their military and political structures. We have inadvertently created a new arms race." "Not inadvertently," Yoda corrected, his ancient voice carrying the weight of civilizational experience. "Inevitable, this outcome was. Whenever power exists, those who seek dominion will pursue it. The Force, amplified by technology, becomes weapon. And weapons, always, are sought by those who believe dominion through strength is path to security. There's another factor," Data interjected, his positronic processors having been analyzing the broader strategic implications. "The Borg cube that engaged the Enterprise D and attacked Kepler Station remains in the region. Sensors indicate it is now stationary, approximately 2 light-years from our current position. Additionally, we are detecting unusual subspace fluctuations consistent with Q continuum activity. And Romulan and Klingon vessels are beginning to converge on this sector, apparently responding to the strategic opportunities presented by force sensitivity." The visualization that Data displayed showed a slowly tightening net of major powers all moving toward the same spatial coordinates. The Federation, the Borg, the Klingon Empire, the Romulan Star Empire, and potentially the Q Continuum itself, all converging on what was becoming the most strategically significant sector of space in the known galaxy. The collision point was inevitable, and the only question was what form the convergence would take. They will not simply negotiate, Worf observed with the tactical certainty of a warrior who understood how power dynamics functioned. When multiple predators converge on prey, conflict is inevitable. Someone will miscalculate. Someone will act first. And once violence begins, alliance patterns will form and shatter in ways we cannot predict. Unless, Riker said slowly, we control the terms of the convergence. Instead of allowing it to occur as chaos, we deliberately engineer a meeting point where negotiation becomes the only viable option. Picard felt something crystallize in his strategic thinking. A conference. Neutral space. A formal diplomatic gathering where the Force itself becomes not a commodity to be acquired, but a philosophical framework to be understood and respected. Ambitious, Obi-Wan said, his warrior's mind recognizing both the brilliance and the danger of such an approach. But fraught with complications. You would be inviting your enemies, your competitors, and beings of omnipotent power to the same table. Control would be impossible. Control was always an illusion, Picard replied, understanding something fundamental about Federation philosophy in that moment. The prime directive isn't about controlling outcomes. It's about respecting the autonomy of others. What if we applied that same principle here? Instead of trying to control how the Force is used, we establish protocols that ensure it cannot be weaponized without universal agreement. Yoda's ancient eyes seemed to reflect something like approval. Wise, this approach is. Recognize you do, what the Jedi learned too late, that control itself is path to corruption. Better to guide, to teach, to present principles without enforcement. The preparations for the convergence took 2 weeks of intensive diplomacy. Picard extended formal invitations to every major power, framing the conference as a summit on existential threats and shared security interests. The location selected was Deep Space Nine, the Federation outpost that existed precisely at the intersection of multiple territorial boundaries. Its commander, Benjamin Sisko, initially expressed skepticism about hosting such an unpredictable gathering, but ultimately agreed when Picard explained the alternative, uncontrolled military convergence that would result in inevitable conflict. Yoda and Obi-Wan agreed to present themselves at the conference, though both expressed profound uncertainty about the outcome. History repeats, Yoda said during one of the final planning sessions. Seen this pattern across civilizations. When power becomes currency, those who control it become targets. Whether we survive this convergence, unknown it is. But fight we must, not with weapons but with truth. The conference chamber at Deep Space Nine was deliberately designed to be circular, with no head position, no hierarchy suggested by spatial arrangement. Representatives from the Federation, Klingon Empire, Romulan Star Empire, and Borg Collective took their positions. The Klingon brought Ambassador Krell, a warrior diplomat of formidable reputation. The Romulans sent Senator Malkus, whose political acumen was matched only by his ruthlessness. The Borg sent a single representative, a drone modified to interface directly with their collective consciousness while retaining enough individuality to negotiate. And then Q appeared, materializing in the center of the circular chamber without warning or invitation, his presence commanding immediate attention. Well, he said, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated through every consciousness in the room, this is delightful. I was beginning to think your species lacked the philosophical sophistication for genuine dialogue about power and consciousness. I may have underestimated you, Picard. Yoda rose slowly from his position, his ancient frame moving with the gravity of ceremony. Welcome, Q, we do. Observer and participant, you choose to be. Both, naturally, Q replied, settling into a position that somehow managed to be both central and separate from the gathering. I've been facilitating small conflicts between your species for millennia. But this possibility of genuine synthesis between mysticism and science, between consciousness and technology, this is worthy of my undivided attention. The negotiations that followed were nothing like conventional diplomatic proceedings. Krell proposed that Starfleet and Klingon warriors be trained simultaneously in force techniques, creating a joint security framework built on shared understanding rather than mutual suspicion. Malchus countered with a proposal that force training be restricted to certified governments, preventing individual force users from operating outside state control. The Borg representative offered something unexpected: cooperation in studying the Force's integration with cybernetic systems, with the understanding that the collective would cease hybrid drone creation if Force sensitivity could be maintained in non-assimilated individuals. The proposal revealed something troubling. The Borg had concluded that creating hybrid drones was strategically inefficient. They preferred to study the Force from a distance while developing countermeasures against its consciousness-based applications. But it was Obi-Wan who articulated the fundamental truth that transformed the discussion: the Force cannot be owned, weaponized, or controlled without destroying its essential nature. Any attempt to make it into an instrument of state power corrupts it. The moment a government claims ownership of Force training, the moment a military force is created from Force-sensitive individuals. The moment the Force becomes a tool of dominion, in that moment, it ceases to be the Force. It becomes something else entirely. Something dark. The conference chamber fell silent. Even Q seemed momentarily at a loss for words. What you're proposing, Malchus said carefully, is that Force training must remain outside state control. That's politically untenable for any government. Perhaps, Yoda acknowledged. But necessary it is, if corruption we wish to prevent. Offer you do, an alternative we will. Sanctuary establish the Enterprise D will, in neutral space. Federation, Klingon, Romulan, Borg, all may send students. Train they will, not in service of Empire, but in service of within Federation territory, yes, but theoretically independent from any government structure. Genius. Absolutely inspired. And doomed, the Borg representative added, its voice carrying the weight of computational certainty. Individual Force-sensitive beings trained outside governmental control will inevitably act against the interests of the powers that educated them. This arrangement creates strategic liability for all participants. Yes, Picard agreed, understanding precisely what the Borg was calculating. Which is why it must be attempted. The alternative is allowing Force sensitivity to become a weapon in galactic power struggles. At least this way, we preserve the possibility that it remains something more. The agreement that emerged from the conference was unprecedented. The Federation would establish a sanctuary on an Enterprise D-affiliated station, where Force-sensitive individuals from any civilization could seek training under Yoda and Obi-Wan's guidance. The Klingon, Romulans, and even the Borg agreed to respect the sanctuaries. The moment the Force becomes a tool of dominion, in that moment, it ceases to be the Force. It becomes something else entirely. Something dark. The conference chamber fell silent. Even Q seemed momentarily at a loss for words. What you're proposing, Malchus said carefully, is that Force training must remain outside state control. That's politically untenable for any government. Perhaps, Yoda acknowledged. But necessary it is, if corruption we wish to prevent. Offer you do, an alternative we will. Sanctuary establish the Enterprise D will, in neutral space. Federation, Klingon, Romulan, Borg, all may send students. Train they will, not in service of Empire, but in service of understanding. Those who complete training, choose they will their own path. Some serve governments, yes. But by choice, not by command. Q laughed, a sound like the birth and death of stars. You're creating a Jedi Academy in the 24th century. Within Federation territory, yes, but theoretically independent from any government structure. Genius. Absolutely inspired. And doomed, the Borg representative added, its voice carrying the weight of computational certainty. Individual force-sensitive beings trained outside governmental control will inevitably act against the interests of the powers that educated them. This arrangement creates strategic liability for all participants. Yes, Picard agreed, understanding precisely what the Borg was calculating. Which is why it must be attempted. The alternative is allowing force sensitivity to become a weapon in galactic power struggles. At least this way, we preserve the possibility that it remains something more. The agreement that emerged from the conference was unprecedented. The Federation would establish a sanctuary on an Enterprise de-affiliated station, where force-sensitive individuals from any civilization could seek training under Yoda and Obi-Wan's guidance. The Klingon, Romulans, and even the Borg agreed to respect the sanctuaries. Neutrality, though all reserved the right to withdraw if the arrangement threatened their security. As the representatives departed and the conference dissolved into diplomatic aftermath, Picard found himself standing beside Q, who had lingered after the formal proceedings concluded. "You've made an interesting gamble, Picard," Q observed. "Creating a power structure based on voluntary participation rather than coercion. Most species would consider this strategically foolish." "Most species built on coercion eventually collapse under the weight of their own contradictions," Picard replied. "Perhaps voluntary participation in understanding the Force is the only framework that can succeed." Q smiled, genuinely, without the edge of mockery that typically characterized his expressions. "You continue to surprise me. Perhaps humanity deserves not to be wiped from existence after all." And with that, Q vanished, leaving behind only the faintest impression of amusement. 6 months had passed since the Deep Space Nine conference, and the galaxy had begun to adjust to the reality of force sensitivity operating outside traditional power structures. The sanctuary established aboard a refitted starbase designated New Jedi Academy had attracted students from across known space. Starfleet officers seeking deeper understanding of consciousness, Klingon warriors pursuing spiritual discipline, even a handful of Romulan operatives who had defected from the Tal Shiar to study philosophy rather than espionage. The Borg, true to their word, had withdrawn their hybrid drone operations, but not out of philosophical enlightenment. Data's analysis suggested they were developing consciousness suppression technologies designed to neutralize force-based attacks at a neurological level. The collective, in its infinite pragmatism, had concluded that if they could not weaponize the Force, they would instead develop means to render it inert. The sanctuary's existence, paradoxically, may have saved countless lives by redirecting Borg research toward defensive measures rather than aggressive assimilation protocols. Picard stood in the observation lounge of the Enterprise D, watching the new Jedi Academy station rotate slowly against the starfield. His career had survived the initial scrutiny from Section 31, though his relationship with Starfleet Command remained complicated and carefully managed. He had struck a bargain with Director Krell. Section 31 would cease active pursuit of force-sensitive individuals in exchange for Picard's agreement to provide monthly reports on the sanctuary's activities and student populations. It was compromise, not victory, but Picard had learned to accept that absolute moral purity was often less valuable than pragmatic progress. The most unexpected development had been the arrival, 3 months into the sanctuary's operation, of Captain Benjamin Sisko from Deep Space Nine. Sisko had requested permission to undergo force training himself, a decision that had surprised everyone but explained itself once he began meditating. The Bajoran religious officer who had struggled for years to reconcile his faith with rational command structure had discovered in force training a framework that integrated both spirituality and scientific understanding. Sisko had become one of Yoda's most dedicated students, his capacity for force sensitivity apparently quite substantial. Counselor Troi appeared at the observation lounge entrance, her empathic senses registering Picard's contemplative state. "You're wondering if we've made the right choice," she observed, settling beside him. "I'm wondering if we've made any choice at all," Picard replied thoughtfully. Or if we've simply been swept along by forces beyond our control, making decisions that felt autonomous but were actually predetermined by larger patterns we couldn't perceive. That's a very Jedi question, Troy noted with a slight smile. Yoda would probably say that choice and fate are not opposites, that the ability to choose is itself part of the larger pattern. Philosophical comfort, Picard said, but not necessarily accurate. No, Troy agreed. But accuracy was never the point of philosophy. Understanding was. The subspace communication alert activated, and data appeared on the monitor with news that sent ripples of concern through the observation lounge. Captain, we are receiving reports of Borg activity in the Gamma Hydri sector. A cube is approaching the new Jedi Academy station. However, the approach vector and communication protocols suggest this is not an assimilation operation. Within the hour, Picard was aboard the new Jedi Academy station, meeting with Yoda and Obi-Wan in the Sanctuary's central meditation chamber. The Borg cube had taken a stable orbital position and transmitted a single message: they wished to conduct formal negotiations regarding the development of consciousness-based defense systems against force manipulation. Fascinating, Obi-Wan observed, his warrior's tactical mind immediately grasping the implications. The Borg are seeking to collaborate with us. They've concluded that understanding the Force requires direct interaction with those who practice it. Dangerous, this path is, Yoda cautioned. Collaborate with the Borg, we do, and risk contamination by their philosophy we do. Consciousness itself, they view as inferior to optimization algorithms. Work with beings who fundamentally deny consciousness's value, difficult it will be. Yet both Jedi agreed to the meeting. The Borg representative who arrived aboard a shuttle was different from previous drones Picard had encountered. It retained sufficient individuality to communicate in something approaching conversational patterns, though its speech remained mechanical and its logic entirely utilitarian. The drone identified itself simply as Unit 7734, and it brought with it data files that suggested the Borg had been analyzing Force consciousness interactions for months. The Force operates through consciousness, Unit 7734 explained, its optical implant rotating with mechanical precision. Consciousness, by collective definition, is inefficient, prone to error, subject to emotion, resistant to optimization. Yet Force-based consciousness appears to generate phenomena that transcend our current understanding of physics. This paradox requires resolution. The collective proposes collaborative research. What form would this collaboration take? Picard asked carefully, aware that any agreement with the Borg carried substantial risks. Borg researchers would study Force-sensitive consciousness in situ, the drone replied. Not assimilation, not integration into the collective. Observation only, with full documentation of findings. The alternative is the collective continuing research independently, using acquired Force. Sensitive individuals as test subjects. Collaboration ensures more ethical treatment of those individuals. It was brilliant and horrible simultaneously, the Borg offering a choice between cooperation and the continuation of their experiments on captive Force users. Yoda and Obi-Wan exchanged a glance that seemed to communicate across dimensions of understanding that pure language could not access. Accept your offer, we will, Yoda said finally. But establish we must protocols. Treatment of Force-sensitive research subjects, governed it will be by standards developed jointly. Experiments conducted on unwilling participants, forbidden they are. And access to the sanctuary, permitted it will be, so observe the natural development of Force consciousness you can. The agreement represented something unprecedented, the Borg collective, an empire built on forced assimilation, accepting limitations on its research methodology. Whether this represented genuine evolution in Borg philosophy or simply a calculated recognition that understanding required cooperation was unclear. But the practical result was that dozens of Force-sensitive individuals currently imprisoned aboard Borg vessels were released and offered passage to the sanctuary. Over the following months, an unlikely collaboration emerged. Borg researchers worked alongside Force-trained Federation officers to document how consciousness and technology might interact without requiring assimilation. The discoveries were remarkable. It appeared that Force-sensitive individuals could interface with Borg technology without experiencing the usual loss of individuality that characterized assimilation. The Borg's assimilation process required severing the subject's connections to their own consciousness and replacing them with collective directives. But Force users maintained consciousness coherence even while interfacing with cybernetic systems. They're evolving, Data observed during one of the research briefings. Not biologically, but philosophically. The Borg are discovering that consciousness and technology are not necessarily opposed, that they might be integrated without requiring the destruction of individuality. Which means, Riker said with evident concern, that the Borg might eventually transform themselves from a purely assimilative threat into something far more complex and potentially more dangerous. Or, Picard countered, it means they might be beginning to understand that consciousness has intrinsic value beyond its utility for optimization. The galaxy continued its gradual transformation. News of the Sanctuary's success spread through subspace channels, and Force-sensitive individuals began emerging from hiding across Federation space, people who had suppressed their natural empathic and intuitive abilities out of fear or lack of understanding. Training programs expanded. The Klingon Empire established its own Force training academy, though with a decidedly more warrior-focused curriculum than Yoda preferred. The Romulan Star Empire maintained official neutrality while quietly allowing Romulan Force sensitives to train at the Sanctuary through back channels and deniable operations. The question of whether Section 31 would eventually move against the Sanctuary remained unresolved. But Picard had established sufficient political complexity around its operations that direct intervention had become strategically risky for Federation intelligence. The Sanctuary had become too valuable, too integrated into Federation culture and the broader Quadrant's political dynamics, to be simply eliminated. 1 year after the Deep Space Nine conference, Picard received a subspace communication from an unexpected source. It was a young ensign named Michael Torres, a Starfleet officer who had completed Force training and was now being assigned to the Enterprise D under Picard's command. The message included a recommendation from Yoda himself, which stated simply, "Ready for greater challenges, Ensign Torres is. Teach him, you will, and learn from him, you may." Picard reviewed Torres's record and discovered something that had not appeared in his initial biographical profile. Torres was the child of 2 Section 31 operatives who had defected to the Sanctuary after their daughter displayed Force sensitivity. They had chosen their daughter's freedom over their careers, and in doing so, had struck a blow against the logic that treating individuals as assets rather than people was acceptable. As the Enterprise D prepared for its next mission, Picard found himself reflecting on how much had changed and how much remained fundamentally uncertain. The Force existed in this universe now, not as a discovered phenomenon, but as a living tradition that had taken root in Federation culture. It had not transformed the Federation into something unrecognizable, nor had it brought universal peace and understanding. Instead, it had become another element in the complex tapestry of galactic civilization, offering possibilities and dangers in equal measure. The Borg continued their research, gradually transforming their approach to consciousness integration. The Klingon integrated Force philosophy into their warrior culture in ways that actually enhanced rather than corrupted it. The Romulans maintained their political distance while secretly training Force sensitives for roles in their intelligence operations. And humanity, in its characteristic fashion, was beginning to discover that there existed aspects of consciousness that transcended the purely rational, purely scientific frameworks that had defined Federation ideology for centuries. Yoda had grown even more ancient, his 900-year lifespan drawing towards some unknown horizon. But his eyes remained luminous with wisdom earned through countless encounters with power, corruption, and the persistent possibility of transformation. Obi-Wan had become a mentor to a new generation of Jedi, rebuilding the Order not through conquest or control, but through teaching, guidance, and the voluntary choice of those who discovered within themselves the capacity to touch the Force. Complete, this phase of the journey is not, Yoda had told Picard during their final meeting before the captain returned to his ship. merely begun, it has. What becomes of the Force in your universe, unknown it remains. But plant we have, seeds of understanding. Grow they will, in ways we cannot predict or control. And perhaps, that uncertainty itself is the greatest gift, the knowledge that consciousness, in all its infinite variation, cannot be dominated or perfected, only honored and respected. As the Enterprise D engaged its warp engines and jumped to faster-than-light velocity, Picard stood on the bridge and reflected on the strange turn that fate had taken. Two ancient warriors from a distant universe had arrived through accident and circumstance, and in their presence, the Federation had been forced to expand its understanding of what consciousness could be, what power might mean, and what it genuinely required to build a civilization founded not on control, but on voluntary participation in the pursuit of understanding. The stars streamed past the view screen, infinite possibilities extending in every direction. The universe remained vast, incomprehensible, and full of mysteries that resisted reduction to scientific principle or rational explanation. And perhaps, Picard thought, that was exactly as it should be. Conclusion. The story of Yoda and Obi-Wan's arrival in the Star Trek universe did not conclude with resolution or closure. Instead, it opened a chapter in Federation history that would continue to unfold across generations, creating ripples of consequence that extended far beyond what any single being could have predicted or controlled. In the aftermath of their dimensional displacement, the galaxy underwent a subtle but profound transformation. Not through conquest or dramatic upheaval, but through the gradual expansion of consciousness itself. The new Jedi Academy became a beacon for those seeking to understand the nature of mind, will, and the mysterious force that connected all living things across the cosmos. Students arrived not just from the Federation, but from Klingon space, Romulan territories, and even a handful of brave individuals who had escaped the Borg collective to pursue paths of individual autonomy. The sanctuary represented something unprecedented. A place where multiple civilizations could send their people not for military advantage or strategic gain, but for genuine education in philosophies that transcended their respective governments' ideologies. Captain Picard's legacy became inextricably linked with this new era. He was remembered not merely as a skilled diplomat or tactical commander, but as someone who had recognized that the greatest threats and greatest opportunities often arrived not through planned channels but through accidents of fate and dimensional instability. His willingness to defy Section 31, to resist weaponization of the Force, and to create space for voluntary participation in Force training set a precedent that echoed through Federation command structure for decades. Some celebrated him as a visionary. Others, particularly those within Starfleet's more authoritarian elements, viewed him with suspicion as having compromised military security in favor of philosophical idealism. The Borg collective, contrary to many predictions, did not immediately attempt to circumvent the protocols established through collaboration with Force-sensitive researchers. Instead, the interaction with Force consciousness appeared to have triggered something fundamental within their collective programming, a questioning of whether assimilation truly represented the optimal path to perfection. Over the years following the initial contact, the Borg gradually shifted toward a model of integration rather than assimilation, allowing certain conquered species to maintain cultural and individual identity while still contributing technological distinctiveness to the collective. Whether this represented genuine philosophical evolution or simply a more efficient assimilation strategy remained debated among Federation analysts, but the practical result was a reduction in forced assimilations and an increase in voluntary Borg association, a paradoxical outcome that suggested even the most rigid systems contained capacity for transformation. Yoda's final years were spent not in isolation or retreat, but in active engagement with the sanctuary's students. He continued to teach until his death at the age of 923, his last lessons focusing on the relationship between acceptance and action, between allowing circumstances to unfold naturally while simultaneously taking responsibility for one's choices. His philosophy, which had seemed alien to Federation rationalism upon arrival, gradually became woven into the fabric of Starfleet doctrine, influencing how officers approached ethical dilemmas and strategic decisions. The Jedi concept of balance, not as stasis or compromise, but as dynamic equilibrium between opposing forces, provided a philosophical framework that actually enhanced rather than conflicted with scientific methodology. Obi-Wan Kenobi lived on, continuing to mentor new generations of Force users well into the 24th century's final decades. He became known not only as a teacher but as a living bridge between two universes, a being who embodied the possibility that consciousness and technology, mysticism and science, could coexist in productive tension. His greatest contribution may have been demonstrating that beings displaced from their original realities did not have to become weapons or tools of the powers that harbored them. Instead, they could become catalysts for transformation, sources of wisdom that illuminated previously invisible possibilities. The larger galaxy beyond the Federation's borders was similarly affected by the emergence of Force sensitivity as a documented phenomenon. Species across quadrants began reporting individuals with Force-sensitive capacities, suggesting that consciousness itself might be more universally distributed than previous models had assumed. Some scientists proposed that the Force represented a fundamental dimension of reality that had always existed, merely unrecognized until beings from another universe provided a framework for understanding it. Others maintained that the Force was unique to the Star Wars universe and that only beings trained by Yoda and Obi-Wan or their students possessed genuine Force sensitivity. The debate continued unresolved, generating philosophical inquiry and scientific investigation that would occupy researchers for centuries. Section 31 ultimately never succeeded in weaponizing Force sensitivity on the scale it had initially envisioned. The very nature of the Force, requiring voluntary training, philosophical commitment, and genuine understanding, resisted militarization in the way that conventional technology could be conscripted for military purposes. Force users trained by Yoda and Obi-Wan maintained their capacity to refuse orders that violated their philosophical principles. Several Section 31 operations were compromised when operatives who had undergone Force training recognized unethical directives and chose to expose them rather than comply. These incidents gradually convinced Federation leadership that the most valuable capacity the Force provided was not tactical advantage, but ethical clarification. The ability to perceive moral dimensions of situations that conventional analysis might overlook. The question of whether Yoda and Obi-Wan could ever return to their original universe remained perpetually unresolved. Dimensional physics suggested that the rift that had brought them to the Federation universe had permanently collapsed, making return impossible without creating another catastrophic subspace disturbance. Both Jedi eventually accepted this reality with the philosophical equanimity that defined their approach to circumstance. They had arrived without intention, and they had chosen to make meaning from displacement. In doing so, they had transformed not only the Federation and the broader galaxy, but themselves. Becoming pioneers of a new form of existence where consciousness and physics, intention and accident, ancient wisdom and cutting-edge technology converged into something neither universe had previously experienced. Perhaps most significantly, the arrival of Yoda and Obi-Wan demonstrated to the Federation that the universe remained fundamentally mysterious, that rationality and science, while powerful tools for understanding reality, could not encompass all aspects of existence. The Force existed not because it could be measured and quantified, but because consciousness itself seemed to operate through mechanisms that transcended conventional physics. In learning to honor the Force alongside scientific methodology, the Federation learned something about humility, about the recognition that there existed aspects of reality that might never be fully explicable through empirical means, and that acceptance of such mystery was not intellectual failure but rather acknowledgement of the infinite complexity of conscious existence. The galaxy, in the end, had been changed not by conquest or dominion, but by the simple presence of two beings who carried with them the accumulated wisdom of 1,000 years and the willingness to share that wisdom with any who genuinely sought to understand. Their greatest legacy was not a new technology or a military doctrine, but a demonstrated possibility. That beings from entirely different universes, operating under fundamentally different assumptions about the nature of reality, could find common ground not through compromise but through mutual recognition of each other's truth. And in the depths of space, where the stars burned eternal and consciousness reached out toward understanding, new possibilities continued to unfold. Each choice made by force-sensitive beings rippling outward to touch countless others, creating patterns of consequence that would echo across generations and dimensions, reminding all who encountered them that the universe was far vaster, stranger, and more wondrous than any single perspective could encompass. Live long and prosper. More stories await.